What does it mean to be a conscientious consumer of food? Does it make a difference to the economy, the environment, or is it simply a personal decision? What do people of faith have to say about it? We'll explore these issues today on the Leading Voices in Food podcast with our guest, Dr. Aaron Gross, an associate professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. I'm Sarah Zubek, associate director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. Aaron Gross is a historian of religions who writes and speaks about animals and factory farming, as well as modern and contemporary Jewish thought and ethics, and Jewish food and animal ethics in particular. He is the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Animals and Religion Group and is the founder and CEO of Foer, a nonprofit advocacy organization that seeks to promote conscientious food choices, reduce animal suffering, and to advance sustainable agriculture. Aaron, so great to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Aaron, you write and speak about animals and factory farming. What first inspired you to engage in this work, both in your scholarship and through Farm Forward?
I think entrance into the food space often comes through different doors. For me, the door was really thinking about animals, and it happened when I was pretty young based on values I had in my family. And the real kind of explosive moment was learning about industrial farming, really from reading materials from nonprofit organizations and just getting a kind of quick picture of what the poultry industry, beef industry, pork industry had come to look like. And I had a very different vision of what that was supposed to be. On my mother's side, she grew up on a working farm. I had a kind of picture of what those ethics were supposed to be. A lot of my own values I understood as really coming out of an experience of being a farmer. And it was this huge delta between the reality of what I had learned had become virtually totally dominant and this other picture of what farming should be that kind of first propelled me into these issues. First with the sensitivity to the animal issue, but once you start paying attention to the system, you realize it's kind of bad for multiple issues at once. Many issues intersect there. So I became more interested in the ecological issues, ultimately the questions of social justice and equity concerned. And so it's not been hard to make a career of it, it turns out.
Great. Well, and you collaborated with novelist Jonathan Safran Foer on the book and subsequent documentary Eating Animals. Could you tell me more about the genesis of that partnership?
Yeah. One of the interesting experiences that I've had is the reactions I get from people when I tell them I'm interested in these issues. In particular, the reactions that I often get to being a vegetarian, which is surprisingly complicated in ways that I didn't necessarily expect. There's a certain kind of way you can find yourself threatening people without having any intention to, because you eat very differently. This was something that Jonathan and I got to kind of bond over when there was a major investigation into a kosher slaughterhouse that became a pretty national issue, broke in the New York Times, follow-up stories, ended up being part of my dissertation later on. But when it first happened, it exposed just horrific animal cruelty in a kosher slaughterhouse, aberrant stuff. So the details are difficult and not necessarily worth the trauma of rehearsing them. Not specific to kosher, or didn't have to be specific to kosher, though it was bound up with it in this case. And Jonathan and I, both as people from a Jewish background, cared about it more because of that kind of connection to our community. And we got talking, and we both had that same experience that his on and off, my fairly steady commitment to vegetarianism had provoked a lot of interesting intellectual conversations, told us that there was some depth going on here, something that was raising deeper questions for people. And that made Jonathan want to write about this. That is a combination of kind of social concern with kind of animal suffering at the center and kind of going out to consider all those other issues I mentioned. And then tying that with the reality that not anybody can talk about these issues. Just directly talking about the animal suffering or environmental pollution or social inequity tied with it often just shuts people down. And so it seemed like a good challenge for somebody who is primarily a novelist and who works kind of with empathy and how do you speak to people on their own terms. And for me, coming at it more as an advocate and a scholar, it was an exciting thing to be able to help somebody who has that facility in writing and that kind of audience talk about these issues. So it was a very exciting collaboration.
Well, I can tell you it was a freshman reading here a couple years ago at Duke University, and I know by senior year a number of students had told me they chose veganism or vegetarianism because of that book. So
that's delightful to hear.
It's a testament to your work. And I'm curious, you started the organization Farm Forward in 2007. So I wonder if you could tell our listeners just what makes the organization unique and what are some of your goals?
Yeah, so at the time I started factory farming, and it was, started Farm Forward, but the related phenomena. It was the only organization that specifically focused on factory farming as an issue, instead of it being a kind of subset of a larger agenda. There were a lot of other organizations working on it at the time, as there are now. I felt good about those organizations, but I thought not being able to focus exclusively on this issue led to certain kind of challenges. So the main motivation was just there wasn't really a space completely focused on this. And one of the effects of that was you tended to have a split in orientation. Some that would be advocating for vegetarianism or veganism as a way to kind of combat or divest from factory farming. And those groups would talk about meat reduction, but very unlikely to talk about high welfare farming and really serious support for farmers who are trying to do it outside of the factory farm system. Certainly no resource allocation. They might feel good about it, but tended to not do it. On the other hand, you had groups which were pretty committed to helping farmers, trying to get people who were running sustainable high welfare farms to survive, but in general, in that community, not so good to acknowledge that vegetarianism and veganism might be another way to challenge the factory farm.
And what do you mean by high welfare farming?
So that's a complicated question, yeah. It would depend on the industry. So we'd have to really drill down and look at specifically, the meat industry and poultry, or the, egg-laying industry and poultry. And I could tell you about some of my particular thoughts. What I'll say is the shorthand is there's a certification called Global Animal Partnership. That's the largest animal welfare certification in the country. It's at all Whole Food stores. The products with that label are sold everywhere. And they break it into 5 tiers. Tier 1 being just a little bit better than industry standard, and step 5 being kind of top tier. And, you could walk through all of those differences. So when I'm saying high welfare, I'm thinking things that are step 3, 4, and 5 on the GAP system, things that are significantly better than average, but may or may not be optimal.
And that's directly related to the treatment, quote-unquote, treatment of the animals.
Yeah. This is so welfare I'm using specifically to refer to the treatment of animals. Yeah, though the correlation between welfare and sustainability and justice issues is far greater than I think is generally appreciated. And in my own kind of reflection on these issues, I think it's often reluctance to address these issues in tandem that leads to kind of fractured approaches to resisting factory farming. I mean, what we do know is nobody's really been successful resisting factory farming. It's just grown and grown more slowly in places where there's been points of resistance, but that's not exactly victory. And I do think that has a lot to do with the way in which people who would have a concern about factory farming have been kind of divided into these different constituencies, which then can be handled.
So how are those things linked, the environmental sustainability and the animal welfare?
Yeah, so a lot of the environmental problems come from concentrating animals in unnatural numbers. And if we look at the kind of history of how that happened, it broke a lot of taboos about how you raised animals. Post-World War II, you have a change in attitude towards farming and the kind of introduction of a strongly, let's say an attitude that claimed science as its guiding kind of light, though more motivated by kind of industry and profit, but claiming a scientific outlook. And they really kind of overthrew husbandry-oriented approaches. So this was very visible at universities. You had departments of animal husbandry closed down and replaced by departments of animal science, which is pretty much what we have today at big land-grant universities, at least in the U.S. It's a little bit more complicated in places like India, where there's still departments of animal husbandry. So husbandry referred to a tradition that was very serious about productivity and economics. It was about raising animals in an economic context, but that had long-standing values that came out of the farm tradition kind of baked into it. That was in some ways the point of critique of the scientists. So this isn't a fully rational system. This is a system that's got these, strange ways of looking at things. They consider, animals as kind of these sentient beings that have to be kind of managed as such instead of just an economic production unit. So straight through the 1970s, if you look at industrial kind of farm magazines and materials, the language, which is not the way they would put it today, but it's extremely explicit in terms of things like treat the pig just like a machine. Don't look at these as animals, look at them as production units. And where you previously had kind of concern for the animal's overall well-being, kind of balanced with profitability and linked to profitability, where you genuinely had an overlap between keeping an animal healthy and vibrant and having an animal that would be profitable for you. And that link was just totally severed in this new system. It said kind of if we completely erase all of our values and just could do anything we want to these animals, how would we raise them? What would we do? And so you had a very different system arise. And one of the things that you started doing was cramming animals in small spaces and figuring out you could make that work if you gave them drugs in their feed and controlled their conditions inside. And then you had a concentration of feces that turned from an advantage in extensive systems that were driven by kind of husbandry logic to becoming a kind of toxic problem. And then you had good old things like the expense of getting rid of that, driving a kind of, let's just let it leak out into the rivers and so forth. And so you have kind of pollution. You also are eliminating at the same time the small farmer. So, if you go back to the 1920s, we're dealing with something like 25 million plus small poultry farms producing eggs with an average flock of less than 30. Now you can't be producing eggs with less than, realistically, probably no less than 100,000 birds. That is a couple barns with at least, 30,000 animals in a barn. Totally different system. So you also went from a lot of independent ownership. A lot of the egg industry was, for example, in the hands of women, to it being owned by these corporations, which increasingly became totally vertically integrated. And so you had all these, questions of how people were now being treated. So instead of it being a place where somebody can, work hard and make a living and build a farm, it became a system where people were, hired hands or these contract farmers, especially in the poultry industry, where they're technically independent farmers, but they don't own their birds. The equipment is stuff that's mortgaged, and they're completely in the control of the large companies by design. So here now we've got a kind of justice issue kind of mixed into this. But it's in some ways driven by kind of throwing out this ethical orientation of traditional animal husbandry and deciding to cease looking at animals as animals and cease looking at farming as a system of organizing how we relate to other life forms and seeing it just as a business.
So then what is Farm Forward's role in taking us back to more of a husbandry and sort of welfare-minded system, and what are the activities that you engage in to do so?
We try to work in three areas. That is changing actual farming practices, changing things on the farm, changing how people are eating, especially at an institutional level, and changing the stories we tell. Obviously, the way I just narrated the history of modern farming is not the way we normally tell that story, which is one of victory and progress and efficiency with, maybe there was a few problems introduced as we got efficient along the way. So in the area of farming, we do a lot of work through certifications. This is one of the ways to add value to a farmer's product in a way that also a consumer who doesn't necessarily have a lot of knowledge can trust. So I see one of the best ways to help farmers is getting them into certification systems, making sure certification systems are actually farmer-friendly, because a lot of the best farmers are least adapted to current certification systems. So I would say that's one of the major areas we're working on right now. If you want to just get a lot of people in a certification system, you're working with industry because that's the dominant industry. And so you could create a certification system that does improve things for animals, improve conditions on the farm for the workers, but isn't necessarily really focusing on the best farmers. It's focusing on a little bit better than the norm. Getting really top farmers in the system and getting them to benefit from it is a more challenging thing. So that's where those tiers I mentioned before, having a tiered welfare system, where your lower tiers are, going to be an inexpensive product that's produced in a way that's better than average, but probably not optimal. Acknowledging that that's not the best, instead of just saying, it's got a humane label, it's perfect. where those 4 and 5 tiers should really be representing, a relatively small number of farmers in tier 5 who are really the leaders and who need to be reached out to, probably don't have the resources to be putting time into doing the kind of paperwork and stuff that's involved in doing these certifications, and getting them in the system in an easy way that really allows them to communicate to the public what they're doing. So,
what are the kind of practices that make you a quote-unquote top-tier farmer in your eyes or the eyes of this certification?
Yeah, so let me speak to that. Again, it'll be industry specific. So let's take the chicken meat industry, which is really the most fully industrialized. And one of the tragedies in the chicken industry that is not as well understood as it could be is the way in which genetics have driven suffering. So the chickens we eat today, if I compare them to chickens from 50, 60, 70 years ago, they're growing 3 times as fast while eating a third the feed daily. So to picture this, you're dealing with, if you were to imagine an analogy with a human child, you've got a 5-year-old who's gone through puberty, looks like they're 15, and they've only eaten breakfast. It's a dramatic modification of the animal's genome. And it's done through a form of breeding that doesn't involve gene splicing, but is definitively, I think, genetic engineering by any kind of common sense definition of it, even if it falls outside of that definition by a certain kind of technical definition. And one of the features of that that's very bad for farmers is it means the animals that are sold to farmers can't be reproduced. So you have to go back to the corporation to get these things. One of the things that's very bad for animals is their bodies are built to grow so fast that for about the last third of their life, they're in chronic pain. They can't walk without pain. They certainly can't fly, which is a normal thing for a chicken to be able to do. I remember seeing kids visit a traditional farm, getting to the higher welfare farm, seeing chickens fly and be like, chickens don't fly. And the farmer responds, my chickens do. So there are farmers who have preserved the traditional genetics. These birds are going to grow slower. They're going to cost more. The feed's going to be a lot more. But they're going to have healthy, robust immune systems. They're going to survive out on pasture. They can navigate through a foot of snow. It's a totally different kind of animal. And that would be the real distinguishing characteristic in poultry of top tier. And if you wanted to identify it, it would be you're looking for American Poultry Association certified breeds, the ones that were pre this kind of hybrid breeding system that I mentioned, this intensified breeding.
So I want to focus in on this top or best or better kind of value-based assignments that you've given, and I wonder how would you respond to folks who would argue that in terms of efficiency and farmer livelihood and the market-based system that they're operating within, how to assign those values of being better on the welfare side versus the ability to run a farm efficiently in the current system that's kind of set people up to do things in a more quote-unquote efficient manner in the CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operations style, and that produces affordable food for folks.
Yeah, two things there. One, I think it's really a myth that the system is efficient. You've caught me that I've said, in the name of efficiency. The reality is the system only appears to be efficient because of the degree of externalities. If you externalize all your environmental costs, if you externalize all your worker, kind of healthcare costs, if you, deliberately organize your processing and slaughter plants with the use of undocumented labor, if you do all these things, you can, quote unquote, be efficient, but somebody's paying for it. And this is not to even get into the health problems that get kind of generated by just a quantity of otherwise previously expensive foods like meat dropping in price and quantity explosion and that creating other issues. So I'm not so sure it's actually more efficient, but a farmer in that system has to face that dilemma, and we just have to be attentive to that. That's where a certification is very powerful, because a certification can allow the farmer to sell their product for more. The truth is there's plenty of people ready to pay more for higher welfare products. The problem is with the supply, is with getting that supply and building the connective tissue in a kind of reliable way. So consumers in some ways have already kind of stepped up and said, if you'll demonstrate to me that this product is really different, I'm ready to pay, a good bit more for it. And this is true across economic classes. I mean, in rural India, with people living on the equivalent of $5 or $6 a day, it is common for them to pay 100% more, twice as much, for eggs or meat from birds that are the equivalent of these heritage birds I mentioned in the Indian context. So whether we're talking about in the U.S. or abroad, wealthy people or people of modest means, they're ready to pay more for animals that have been raised in a good way. We just haven't created a system that allows the truly high welfare farmer to distinguish him or herself from somebody who's just trying to game the system and make money off of this, demand. So, free range, for example, unregulated term, means virtually nothing. Somebody who's marking up their chicken and calling it free range might be doing something better, might not.
Great.
And those are the kinds of problems we need to address.
Well, Aaron, I want to make sure we also get to the faith-based element as well, because your scholarship focuses on religion, especially the Jewish tradition. So how does that factor into your work, this faith-based element?
Excellent, yeah. So I mentioned that one of the things Farm Forward tries to focus on is narrative. One of the things I think we often don't realize in change movements is the degree to which we have kind of narratives that shape what we do. And this is where religion becomes very powerful, because religion often holds the kind of master narratives that guide us. And communities of faith are the places where we discuss these stories about who we want to be. Is efficiency our ultimate value? At the end of our lives, do we want to say, and I was efficient as a farmer? Or do we want to talk about values like stewardship, which has long tradition going back to the Bible? And what would that really mean? And how would it look like? So faith communities, I think, are both places we can tell the story of farming differently and also resources for what that new story might look like.
Great. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for being on the Leading Voices in Food series. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and for being with Iris.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and our guest today is Dr. Aaron Gross, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of San Diego. And I'd also like to make a special thank you to our listeners, as always. Please subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food at soundcloud.com or by visiting the Duke Worldview Policy Center website. This is Sarah Zubek.